This presentation is titled Changing Methodologies, the Activities Teachers Use in Japanese High School English Classes. My name is Sean Yamada with Doshisha International Junior and Senior High School.
My name is David Clayton. I'm with Doshisha Women's College of Liberal Arts.
Today we'll be going through the presentation in the following structure. Dave will be talking about the background and the study in general. I will be discussing the methods and results, and then Dave will be talking about the implications of the results. Then it will return to me for a conclusion. Afterwards, we will have a brief question and answer session.
This research came about as a result of my experience several years ago when I transitioned from teaching at a private junior high school to teaching at the university associated with that junior high school. In the junior high school, I found that the students were very bright and confident and really willing to communicate, and we could have quite meaningful conversations. In the university, I found that the students were much more reluctant to communicate and seemingly less able as well. And I wondered what was going on, what had happened in Japanese high school English teaching classes. And so this research was born. Before we go into the research, I'm going to go through a quick background of English education in Japan. A lot of this may not be new to you, but I think it's useful to set our research into context. You'll see some dates appearing on the screen, and I'll fill in the details of those dates as I speak. Okay, in 1809, systematic teaching of English was initiated by the shogunate. In 1881, English became part of the middle school curriculum. In 1901, Howard Swan, a linguist, was invited to Japan and proposed that the natural method be used to teach English. This emphasized oral production and L2 instruction. This proposal was not widely adopted. In 1924, the Education Ministry employed Harold E. Palmer. He's a proponent of the direct method or the oral method, and some of his recommendations were employed in the 1930s, but the number of English classes were actually reduced during that decade, and his recommendation for 6 English periods per week were not introduced until 1947. Again, though, soon after 1947, the number of English classes was reduced. In the 1950s, audiolingual approach was becoming prevalent in Japan. This features repetition, controlled selection of grammar patterns for practice, and contrastive analysis of English and Japanese. However, due to the influence of university entrance examinations, grammar translation remained the main focus of high school English classes. In 1978, Iwamura commented that English classes are conducted in exactly the same fashion as they were 30 years ago, in 1948, or maybe 80 years ago, 1898. Iwamura claimed that grammar translation was still the most common method used. He gave reasons for this. He said that university English professors are not specialists in TEFL. Also, the class sizes were too large, so newly qualified teachers tended to fall back on the methods that they'd become familiar with as high school students themselves, namely grammar translation. If we jump forward to the 21st century, there's lots of literature that characterizes the current state of English education in Japan in a similar way to Iwamura 40 years ago, even though the Ministry of Education, or MEXT, has issued several policies which seem to be oriented toward communicative language teaching. In 2009, MEXT made the following policy announcements: that language activities should be interlinked for comprehensive learning in order to enhance the opportunities for students to be exposed to English, transforming classes into real communication scenes. They also stated that grammar instruction should be given as a means to support communication. However, despite these announcements, few graduates of Japanese high schools can communicate effectively in English. In 2019, Japanese TOEFL IBT takers scored an average of 72 points, beating only Laos in the rankings of Asian countries. In 2020, Japan ranked 55 out of 100 countries in the English First English Proficiency Index, although it has greater internet penetration, more schooling years, and a larger population than average. So clearly, there is room for improvement. Despite these fairly damning statistics, there is a dearth of research into the methodologies that influence the content of English classes in Japanese high schools. There is some research that would focus on a single methodology, for example, communicative language teaching or CLT, and other research which tends to be quite small scale. So what we'd like to do is do something a bit larger scale and find out what kinds of methodologies from a range are actually used by Japanese teachers of English in high schools. We chose to focus on the four methodologies that you can see on the screen now. That's grammar translation, or GT, direct method, DM, audiolingual, AL, and communicative language teaching. I'll leave that slide on the screen for a minute so you can review the characteristics and features of those methodologies, and then Sean will take us through the methods and our results.
Moving on to methods, starting with data collection. We created a survey with the goal of establishing how current teaching of English in Japan, Japanese high schools can best be classified in terms of four distinct teaching methodologies. As outlined in the introduction, and to reiterate them, grammar translation, direct method, audiolingual, and communicative language teaching. The survey was distributed to Japanese licensed high school teachers using Google Forms. The survey was sent out via email, posted on several different social media sites, and shared directly through contacts within both Dave and Sean's network. The data was collected over 3 months and took a great deal of time to generate the responses we got. The four representative activities typically associated with each methodology were chosen and included in the survey, and respondents were asked if and how frequently, from never, some rarely, sometimes, or often, they employed them in their high school English classes. The allocution of the activities to methodologies was verified by a panel of experts made up of university professors and experts in linguistics. All of the members in the panel had a minimum qualification of a master's degree in teaching English as a foreign language or applied linguistics, and had extensive English teaching Japan in several different contexts. To avoid influencing the respondents, the activities were not labeled according to the methodologies. They represented it and were presented in a random order. And an example is present on the slide for the communicative language teaching methodology. The teacher has the students take part in a discussion, and the Japanese is listed below. The surveys were completely anonymous, and additional information was collected related to the respondents' qualifications, educational background, their experience teaching, and the courses they taught. The respondents were also given an opportunity to have reflections and their opinions at the end of the survey. Moving forward, I'd like to discuss how we processed the data and the results we found. There were 104 responses to our survey to highlight the types of activities being practiced and thus the major teaching methodologies followed in English classes in Japanese high schools. We elected to divide the responses into two different groups. The first group was comprised of never and rarely responses, and the second group was comprised of sometimes and often responses. As you will see in the chart in the following slide, these groups are labeled no low use and some high use. The difference in the number of responses in each group was calculated in order to discover the teacher's preferences for each of the four methodologies investigated in this study. The results show that teachers reported that overall they conducted activities in class that are associated with the audiolingual and grammar translation methodologies much more frequently than those associated with the direct method and communicative language teaching methodologies. The only activities that teachers reported a greater frequency of no or low use than some or high use were those associated with communicative language teaching methodologies. The activity that most teachers reported often conducting in their classes was grammar translation. This was labeled grammar translation. Question number 2. Teacher explains an aspect of the language in Japanese. The activity that teachers reported using rarely or never was our communicative language teaching number 2, where students conduct a role play in English. Below in this next graph, next slide is a graph of the differences between uses activities in the four methodologies. I will leave this here briefly before passing the mic back to David for our discussion section.
The first finding that merits discussion is the answer to our question GT2, which was teachers were asked if they explained grammar rules, vocabulary, or cultural and linguistic differences in Japanese. 102 of our 104 respondents said that they do this sometimes or often. There's lots of ways you could interpret this, but one thing I think this result certainly doesn't do is show that teachers are following the MEXT directive from 2009, which stated that classes in principle should be conducted in English. Another question that is worthy of discussion is GT3, where teachers were asked if they give students a prompt and the students create a sentence. And 96 out of 104 of our respondents said they rarely or never do this. We thought this kind of giving a prompt to create a sentence activity would not be unusual in a grammar translation class. For example, a teacher might want to check if students have understood an explained grammar rule sufficiently to create their own sentence using that rule. So with this, we found this result a little surprising. And then we realized that using the term grammar translation as a methodology doesn't directly correspond with what's often known as Japanese grammar translation, or yakudoku, which is literally translation reading. Yakudoku seems to be what the Japanese high school teachers of English are employing in their classes rather than what Western linguistics would understand to be grammar translation. Although yakidoku and grammar translation do have some overlap, and they both have an almost exclusive focus on written text rather than speaking and listening skills, there are also some important differences. While grammar translation places an emphasis on grammatical rules, these are less important in the yakidoku class, where the main focus is word-for-word translation from English to Japanese. The goal is 100% accuracy in the translation. This is connected to the second difference, because the goal of yakidoku is to understand the context of a text in Japanese. Translation only occurs from L2 to L1. On the other hand, a grammar translation class might include translation in both directions. So as you can see, in yakidoku, no importance is attached to the production of the language, but with grammar translation, there is potential for productive activities such as RGT3 to take place. So this result implies that yakidoku is still a dominant, or at least a popular, teaching paradigm in Japanese high schools, and that it is different from grammar translation as Western linguists would understand. Our results also showed that Japanese high school teachers of English had positive attitudes towards tightly controlled audiolingual type activities. On the screen now you can see two clients where we've arranged the methodologies that were under investigation. On the top one, we've arranged them on a client from teacher-centered to student-centered, with grammar translation on the far left and communicative language teaching on the far right. Below that, this client shows, we believe, the amount of L1 and L2 that tend to be used by teachers in each of the four methodologies. Looking at these two, and if we combine them, we feel confident that English classes in Japanese high schools tend to be teacher-centered and with a high use of L1. Again, this seems to contradict the advice from MEXT that language activities should be interlinked for comprehensive learning, and the classes should be conducted in English, and the grammar instruction should be given as a means to support communication. We've also shown that uptake of communicative language teaching techniques has been limited in Japanese high school English classes. We believe there are three possible reasons for the limited uptake of communicative language teaching activities in classes. Firstly, washback, that university entrance examinations rarely evaluate speaking, so activities like role play, discussion, even free conversation might be seen by the teachers and the students as a waste of time. Also, if class sizes are large, that could make conducting communicative language activities at least seem to be impractical. And probably the most important is teacher training, or the lack of it. I think that once teachers have completed their initial training, there's not a strong culture of continued professional development, and so teachers may have not been introduced to communicative language teaching techniques, or may have been introduced to them but don't feel confident conducting them in class, and so on. And I think all of these things can combine, but particularly the teacher training, and they lead to teachers tending to fall back on the activities that they were exposed to as students in high school. So we'll go back to the quote from 1978 from Yamada, that classes are conducted in exactly the same fashion as they were 30 years ago, or maybe 80 years ago. final point before I move on to the limitations of our research and directions for future research is that we'd like to stress that we're certainly not saying that communicative language teaching is the be-all and end-all. We're just noting and observing that it doesn't seem to occur very much in Japanese high school English teachers' classes, and that seems to go against the policy announcements of MEXT. Finally, I'll talk about the limitations of this research. Firstly, clearly, categorizing the frequency with which individual teachers conduct various activities is by nature subjective. Right? One teacher may include an activity that they do once a week as sometimes, and another teacher might label that as often. Also, we made no distinction between public and private high schools. Some private high schools really emphasize English language teaching, so they can allocate more lesson time to English classes, and that could give teachers more freedom to use a wider range of techniques. We didn't make a distinction there. Another pair of limitations concern the contents of the survey. Firstly, we didn't account for the difference between Western grammar translation and Japanese yakidoku. So this may have led to our results being skewed towards AL, audiolingual, and away from GT, grammar translation. Also, to reduce the burden on respondents and to make the survey simple, we asked teachers to report on their English classes as a whole rather than focusing on individual courses. Thus, we didn't achieve a level of granularity that would have been useful, but then the survey would have been about 8 times as long as it was. If we were to repeat the research or conduct similar research in the future, it might be interesting to investigate the relationship between teachers' length of service and the types of activities that they use, and also, again, teachers' length of service and how much L1 and L2 they use in their classes. Okay, I'll hand back over to Sean, who will go through our conclusions.
Onto our conclusions. Notwithstanding the limitations outlined here in our presentation, we feel that we are able to make the following recommendations. Echoing the recommendations of other authors and experts, we recommend that if teachers are to implement and reach for the goals set forward by MEXT, they should include more L2 instruction and incorporate communicative language teaching methodologies in their classrooms. The barriers to this, namely lack of L2 ability, washback from university entrance exams, situational factors such as class size and time constraints, a lack of training in communicative language teaching, along with institutional and cultural resistance to communicative language teaching as a whole have been outlined in the presentation. Implementing change in the Japanese education system has never been easy. These barriers are not insurmountable. We feel that while MEXT's commitment to fostering communicative ability is laudable, if it wishes to realize genuine change in the classroom, it should provide teachers with the support they need in terms of language support, improving situational factors, and providing formal ongoing training. That is, if change is sincerely desired. Thank you very much for your careful attention. We hope this presentation has been fruitful and that it does institute change in the Japanese high school English classes that we addressed in the survey. we will be available for questions and answers after the presentation, and our emails are now presently shown on the current slide, and references will be shown shortly after. Thank you very much.